Welcome everyone to day 2 of the Pathways to Development conference. Today is the political science takeover day of the conference. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Stephen Wilkinson, who is the Nilkani Professor of India and South Asian Studies and Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Yale University. He is also director of the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies and the vice provost for global strategy at Yale. Chances are, if you've taken a course on South Asian politics at any point, you're familiar with and have encountered Professor Wilkinson's work. He's written and edited award-winning books and articles on a diverse set of subjects of interest to many in this room on political violence, patronage and clientelism, and civil-military relations. Our conference theme on pathways to development gestures forward-looking, thinking about how we can build a more inclusive and sustainable future. But we think that there's a shared understanding that in order to really understand processes of change, we also need to look back at and have an understanding of not just our history, but also the history of other nation states. So the question of where do we go from here requires us to ask and understand rigorously how we got here in the first place. And it is in this space that Professor Wilkinson's talk today is situated. Specifically, he's going to be talking about research on the legacies of political violence, not just for the structure of nation states and its institutions, but also for its ideational foundations. He's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a moderated Q&A. And before I hand it over to Stephen, I also want to thank him for his vision of South Asian studies as pluralistic and one that is strengthened through comparative politics, to comparative scholarship and academic exchange. And also to Dr. Kasturi Gupta, who's here today, and she's the Director of Programs at the South Asian Studies Council at Yale, and has been working to help make that vision a reality by laying groundwork for more faculty and students who work on South Asia to engage with Pakistan. And with that, Stephen, we're so glad to have you here. Please take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so I want to start by talking to you about a very famous day in history, July the 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille fortress and prison in Paris, France, the beginning of the French Revolution, one of the largest political changes in history. I think most people know that there was a large crowd outside that attacked the Bastille fortress, the symbol of the French monarchy and repression on that day. What people may not know is initially the attack was very unsuccessful. The fort was well defended by troops. The gates were very sturdy. What changed the mob's ability, the crowd's ability to take over the fort was the fact that they called up veterans and soldiers from the Garde Française and other regiments who placed cannon in front of the fort door, organized the cannon, aimed them, and then the governor of the fort at that point, realizing that the cannon were arranged against the gate and were going to explode, then gave up the fort and allowed the soldiers in. And amongst these soldiers and veterans that were involved in the crowd that day were returnees from the American War of Independence who had fought in the French delegation, in the French forces under Rochambeau that had been sent to fight in the American War of Independence. So this is one instance of soldiers who've returned from war who are involved in very substantial political change, political events subsequently. And my co-author, Sumitra Jha, and I are involved in a larger comparative project where we're interested in thinking about the role of military experience and involvement in wars in general in subsequent political change. How does war affect political change, and how do the micro-experiences that people have in war then translate into political change and political organization when they come back after war? So that's the broad framework. That's where we're headed. The ability of non-elites in general to organize and threaten violence occurs in a lot of larger theories of conflict. And I give citations here from Marx, but also you could think of Carlos Bosch's work by Acemoglu and Robinson, in which the capacity of the subalterns, the poor, the worse off, to extract change by threatening violence is a really key part of the overall theories that are there. And we argue that one important way in which the poor acquire the abilities, the organization, the skills in order to be involved in this is in times of war when external threats leave elites with really no option but to train large numbers of people and give them military skills and military experience. And once the genie has been taken out of the bottle, it's hard for elites to control what subsequently happens, at least in the short term. So war provides non-elites an opportunity to learn to fight. They're also exposed to new ideas, although these are often harder to measure than some of the military experiences that they get, to organize and build networks, as well as to demonstrate heroism and signal willingness for extreme sacrifice for the nation. So once non-elite individuals have these skills and heroic credentials, they then subsequently play leadership roles when they return home that shape political events subsequently. So that's the overall structure. And the approach that we have in a series of papers and then in the larger project is to exploit natural experiments that give quasi-random deployment to try and measure the effects of war. Now, of course, not every war will give you natural experiments that you can use in this way. Several do, several don't. So it's a larger comparative project that looks at a large variety of military experiences through history. And in depth, we drill down on a few of them where we're able to take advantage of quasi-random deployment to military service. And as we're in Pakistan and Punjab, I thought I'd start off by talking about a specific South Asian case and then move on and talk about the French case that we're working on at the moment to give you a sense of the overall project. Let's see, let's do this first. So in general, we take the view, if we're thinking about the larger comparative set of cases that we look at, that the effects of war are going to be different depending on a couple of different things. One is the scale of war. Is it limited in terms of recruiting relatively small proportion of the population and deploying them for a relatively limited purpose, or is it what we might think of as an existential war that includes very, very large numbers of people from the population as a whole, like World War I or World War II might be examples of the latter case. And then the other issue is it limited in time or is it prolonged in time? If you have the 100 Years' War or the Napoleonic Wars or very long wars that require mobilization of the whole resources of the country for decades, then the state is going to need to make larger changes than it is in a more limited context. And we think there are several different paths that you're likely to see in terms of political change, depending on whether wars are limited or existential, or over quickly or prolonged. So here's a context here. That one is limited mobilization, where you have a relatively small proportion of the population. We think that's conducive to civil conflict, and we're going to give a couple of examples of that today. One is World War II vets and ethnic cleansing and the partition of South Asia, which I'm going to talk about just now. Another might be the case of the French Revolution. So both the cases today are drawn from this cell, but we can also think of larger decisive wars, like the Napoleonic Wars, the Russian Revolution, and the third one would be large forever wars, where we get massive mobilization. If it's a forever war, the elites have time to adapt strategically to what's going on in response to what the subalterns are doing at particular times. They can state build. If people are familiar with Charles Tilley's work, it's very consistent with that approach. They can build fiscal capacity, they can engage in military reforms, or they can share financially and grant incremental political rights to others, as happened maybe in Meiji Japan in the 19th century or England in the 17th century. And just to give you a sense of the kind of cases that we look at in different parts of this, if you're thinking of existential wars, we look at the Napoleonic War veterans from the late 18th century through to 1815 and what they do subsequently in terms of fighting for political rights in England and elsewhere. Sumitra, in terms of larger existential wars, has papers that look at the UK and US, and then today we're looking at South Asian veterans and French veterans after the partition of India and Pakistan, and then in the French Revolution. So that's where we're headed. First, to talk about the South Asian case. In the partition of India. So I don't need to really tell people in this room this is a major world event. The dislocation of individuals is absolutely massive. 14.5 million are displaced between 1947 and 1948. The numbers of deaths due to the partition violence are quite hard to estimate because so many people die that aren't recorded. They're killed, they're not recorded. Estimates just vary very widely. In part because they vary so widely, I think a better way to think about the demographic effect is maybe think of the number of people who aren't there by the time 1951 comes along. And Bhardwaj, Khwaja, and Mian tried to estimate, given known outflows and inflows, what the demographic effect was in individual districts in between 1941 and 1951 in terms of the flows. And they estimate there are 3.4 million missing people by 1941. So this is an enormous demographic effect. Policymakers really didn't anticipate at all the scale of the catastrophe that was going to unfold as a result of the partition. And what we are interested in is the extent to which military veterans are involved in the violence in 1947, 1948. So one obvious way of thinking about the causes of partition violence is to say it's a legacy of previous Hindu-Muslim conflict in India and Pakistan, and that's really a driver of the conflict. But in fact, the patterns of violence in 1947, 1948 are very, very different than the pre-independence patterns of Hindu-Muslim conflict. So I actually collected a lot of data on pre-1947 patterns of Hindu-Muslim conflict, and they really don't track very well at all with the observed patterns of violence that we see in 1947, 1948. Policymakers in 1946, 1947, the police, others expected that the main areas were likely to be in UP, Bihar, and Bengal, and that isn't actually where you saw the largest violence in 1947, 1948. There were large-scale forces deployed at the time of the partition throughout Punjab. The 4th Division, which was a crack military unit that had served extensively in Europe and elsewhere during the war, was assigned as the Punjab Boundary Force to try and keep order. This was not a group of paramilitary forces. This was literally one of the top divisions in the entire army. And even they had problems controlling the violence in 1947. And reports at the time said one of their main challenges was that these were people with military skills that were opposing them, attacking refugees using military tactics, organized people using mortars, machine guns, a variety of military tactics in 1947, 48. Ordinarily, perhaps the deployment of large-scale military forces might have been sufficient to manage to control the violence, but at least qualitative sources have long suggested, and contemporary sources have long suggested, that military officers were involved, that there were military officers and former soldiers who were involved in the violence. But of course, it's hard to tell, was that true or was that not true before you collect systematic data on this. And as you see, there are some quotes where people who've looked at the historical documentation on this are saying soldiers were heavily involved. So what Sumitra and I did was collect systematic data on the military experience of different units during World War II. We used the official history of the Indian Army of World War II. We documented the military combat experience of each individual unit during World War II, and then we averaged that back to individual districts to work out what a district's combat exposure was during the war. And then what we do in this paper is we try and then relate that to actual levels of both confirmed dead, but as I've said, we think a better measure is the overall number of missing people in each district in 1951, to try and get some estimate as to whether the level of veterans in a district and the level of combat experience in an individual district does seem to be statistically related to the observed levels of ethnic cleansing that we find. So one obvious concern is, could veterans have really been that important? Were there enough veterans in particular areas? So South Asia in World War II recruited the largest volunteer army in world history up until that time, with well over 2 million people serving in the army. And of course, in these areas, in Punjab, in what was then NWFP, in some of the areas of Western UP and elsewhere, there are very, very large numbers of people there. Recruitment at the time wasn't equal, of course, and it's still not equal with regard to the population. Some classes of the population are recruited much more than others. And there's also an interesting aspect to this, that some minority populations and individual classes in some districts are recruited more than others. So some districts will recruit Sikhs more, some districts will recruit Hindus more, some districts will recruit Muslims more. And that varies substantially by district. So the military recruiting handbooks say you will recruit more Punjabi Muslims in this district than you will in that district. There's a lot of variation in terms of the recruitment. We argue, and I think we demonstrate pretty effectively in the paper, that patterns of deployment combat were random once you'd been recruited. So recruitment isn't random, but once you're in the army, you are deployed on an as-random basis to different degrees of combat exposure. And we looked very hard in the archives to see if there was evidence that could disprove that assumption, and we only found really one or two isolated cases where the generals in charge chose Gurkhas because they had previously served in a Gurkha battalion. But in general, the patterns of deployment in combat are pretty as random. There's a lot of emphasis in the military handbooks that people be deployed on an as random basis. There's no evidence that, oh, we're fighting the Italians on this front, therefore we need people from this community. There's nothing like that to disprove that. And then if we look statistically to try and figure out whether we can see any variables that predict combat exposure, we don't find them. So we use qualitative and quantitative data to try and establish whether the patterns of deployment are as random, and we really don't find evidence that that is the case. Here's just one example from the 1st Punjab Regiment of the differences you see in patterns of deployment and the months that they're deployed at the front line. There's a lot of variation even within regiments in terms of the degree of combat exposure different battalions get. Some are back home guarding things, some are sent off to Japan, some are sent to other places in the world. There's a lot of variation that we find. So on the left here, this is the measure that we come up with after we look at military exposure. Our variable here is, were you involved in an exchange of fire with the enemy in a particular month? And if yes, we code that as a 1. There are other measures we could use, but we think that's likely to be the most reliable measure that's documented most systematically in the sources, so that's why we choose that as a measure. And you get some idea on the left here of what that pattern of exposure looks like across all of pre-1947 India, with enormous concentrations of combat exposure up in the north and west of the country, what's today Pakistan. And then on the other side, we have measures of this is the Bardwaj, Khwaja, and Mian information on the number of missing people by 1951, the degree of ethnic cleansing, if you like, that we see. So this is our main independent variable and our main dependent variable in the study. Just to summarize, what we find is that districts that have an average extra month of veteran combat experience in World War II reduced their number of minorities in 1951 by around 1 percentage point, from an average minority level of around 14 percentage points. And you also get increased outflows of minorities in areas where you have extra months of veteran combat experience by roughly 20,000 people. And the effects are larger in districts that have larger minority ratios to begin with. And I'll just drill down on that a little bit. Here's some of the regression. I just want to give you a sense of some of the things we control for. So we're interested in the degree of literacy, the extent to which there's economic inequality in a district, which we measure with landless laborers, the extent to which you have, quote, martial classes as a variable. We also look at previous Hindu-Muslim riots from 1850 to 1942, and we try and get some measure of violence and crime in districts. So what I did was go and look at the cognizable crime in individual districts from colonial records as well, and we look at things like the number of police and watchmen and number of gun makers as an indicator of what might have been a pre-independence demand for violence or supply of violence in individual districts. So we try as much as we can to try and look at a reasonably systematic list of variables that measure economic and social and religious conflict in individual districts. And what we find is that combat months really seem to have a big effect on the level of ethnic cleansing in districts, and combat months interacted with the titular minority that's being recruited in a district also seem to have an effect. And I'll give you a little bit of qualitative data here. So what we're thinking of is where you have a district that has a large military-trained majority, but the minority in that district doesn't have military experience, you're likely to have higher levels of ethnic cleansing. But where the minority group in a district that has to flee at the time of independence has more military training, they'll be more organized, they'll be better able to protect themselves in the partition and more effective in moving themselves en masse to somewhere else. So you're likely to get differential effects based on those things. So here's just some evidence in the district of Lyallpur of Sikhs in the run-up to independence taking lots of measures to try and defend themselves before the partition comes along and organize flight. In Lyallpur, you had far fewer disturbances than in neighboring districts, and a much more effective emigration in terms of protecting members of the minority community. And here's just a quote from Ian Morrison, who was a very entrepreneurial foreign correspondent at the time, who traveled extensively in Punjab during the disturbances, where he's talking about the very military way in which Sikhs organized the mass flight from Lyallpur district. And you can see he's talking here about ex-servicemen and soldiers are involved in organizing this, the way in which they protect themselves, organize pickets, really organize this in a very military fashion on the way through. So the bottom line is that the ethnic cleansing in the partition of India we find is worse in districts when veteran organized ethnic majorities face large ethnic minorities that lack veteran leadership. So this was really a very interesting case for us. It was one of the first cases that we looked at in this larger project. And now I'm going to switch gears a little and talk about the French case, which is one that we're working on right now. We have a working paper that's up on Sumitra's page that we've had since well, we've had it for years, but it's been posted since January on SOM's Stanford page, if anybody is interested. So back to the Bastille. This is another natural experiment. It's a super interesting case. The French monarchy in the late 18th century sent forces to help the US in the War of Independence. There were several different forces that were sent. The main one was headed by Rochambeau. There's 6,500 troops that are sent. They come in up to Rhode Island in the north here, and then they spend significant amounts of time there. They go through New England, and eventually they come down, and they play a very decisive role at the pivotal battle in the American War of Independence, which is at Yorktown. The French are very important to that victory. The soldiers really didn't select themselves for service at all. There's no evidence to suggest that they selected themselves for military service. And very interestingly, some of the army went to America, but more soldiers than were supposed to go, and there was a shortage of ship transports. So you have a large group that's supposed to go, and one group can't go because of the shortage of military transports and a blockade. And they're very similar in all respects to those people who did go. So that's very good for us. We can compare those who did go with those who don't, and then try and assess whether there's a relationship between the combat experience that they got in the Americas and their participation in the political and social turmoil of the revolution after they come back, to try and estimate, in the same way as we did in the Indian case, whether their military and combat exposure seems to be related to the political phenomena subsequently. So that's where we're headed. We collected an enormous amount of data on the individuals who fought in these forces. There are some published versions that are out there that have been collected at various times, but we found that there were many gaps in them. So fortunately or unfortunately, we had to go back to the mothership in the French archives, which have the original military ledgers still from each regiment, which give you details on each soldier. And so this has been really a decade-long project in trying to create a huge database. It also has had problems because the census itself was a creation of the French Revolution, and the modern French districts, the department, were also a creation of the revolution. So what we had to do was to digitize the pre-independence bailliage political units and go back and try and get as many of the indicators and variables as we possibly could from pre-1789 France in order to try and get a useful set of variables that we could use as controls in the analysis. And this map just gives you a sense. This is, on the left, a map of the bailliage, which are quite small and very well defined. So we created this from original French maps of the time. And then you see the department units, which are much bigger on the right-hand side, overlapped on the bailliage. This is just to give you a sense that the bailliages are much smaller units, much more disaggregated units, as well as being the key political units in 1789 if we want to conduct the analysis. So that's why we chose the bailliage rather than departments. This is just to give you a sense of where Rochambeau's veterans were from. This is again from the original French archival material. As you see in the north and the east, that's where the army is disproportionately drawn from at the time. And this gives you a sense of Rochambeau's veterans versus the Neustrie and the Anhalt veterans. These are the guys who were kept at home because of shortage of transport. The Anhalt was actually a German regiment. It was called a German regiment, but many of the troops were actually recruited from France, including from areas that had been taken from German-speaking areas. So it's not really correct to say, you know, it's a German regiment, therefore it doesn't count. So, and as you see, the distributions are not, in fact, that dissimilar. On most of the observable variables, here the outcome is the log of the number of veterans serving in Rochambeau's force. So we tried to look just statistically, but also in terms of the qualitative data, as well as data like heights, to see if there was any difference that we could observe between those who went and those who didn't, and different degrees of combat exposure. And we weren't able to find really any variables, as in the Indian case, that were systematically related to being sent into combat. As far as we can work out, these are very, very similar groups of soldiers, those who went and those who didn't. And just to give you a sense of the overall finding, there's no evidence that regiments were selected for military service in America based upon things like soldier heights, regiment prestige. They actually have a ranking in the French army at this point of which are the most prestigious regiments, and we tried to look and see whether the distribution of those who went was systematically different than a random draw from that, and we find it wasn't, or any other factors, including qualitative accounts of how people were actually deployed. And veterans of the American War of Independence are more likely to be moderate constitutionalists when they come back. They're more likely to support the liberal revolution that begins in 1789 with some limits. They're also less likely to support things after the revolution turns more destructionist with the execution of the king several years later. So they're moderate liberal reformers, definitely amongst the officers, but not so much revolution at any price kind of people. Bailliage, with greater share of American veterans of all ranks amongst the recruits, are more likely to submit revolutionary cahiers. These were the documents of complaint in 1789 from each individual bailliage about what kind of reforms would you like to see in society. And a historian, Beatrice Hislop, collected and coded a lot of these in the 1930s and subsequently, and we used Beatrice Hislop's analysis to try and figure out which individual bailliage are more liberal, more pro-reform. And what we find is that relates quite well to the number of veterans in individual units. They're more likely to organize reformist political clubs from 1790 onwards. They're also more likely to have peasant rebellions in 1789 to 90, but not before. We can control, because there are good measures that French historians have come up with for the level of peasant rebellions prior to 1789-90. And we don't find a relationship before, but we do find one afterwards. And there are differences in terms of these units with American returned veterans compared to the Neustrie and the Anhalt units that didn't go. So these effects are really driven by the American War of Independence exposure. Let's see, how are we doing on time? About 10 more minutes? Yeah? 5 minutes, okay. So I'll just give you some sense. This is, let's see, the Bourbonnais regiment. One of the key things in the French Revolution is that the army stays loyal to the revolution in the early stages of the revolution. And the Bourbonnais regiment, which was an American returned one, for instance, is the only one of the 8 regiments that are garrisoned in the town of Metz to actually remain loyal to the revolution. The American unit actually keeps order and supports the revolution. Underneath here on the left-hand side, you can see the military gazette. The French took a newspaper with them, took a printing press to the Americas in the American War of Independence, and they published it throughout their trip. And we know, because the newspaper survived, that they're reprinting what's going on in the American Revolution, and they're printing extracts from Tom Paine here. So it's very difficult when we're looking in the larger project at military experience overseas to figure out what the ideological treatment is sometimes when people are going abroad, which kind of ideological exposure they're getting to. It's somewhat easier in this case because we know that the military officers themselves were billeted with local American families involved in the revolution, and that the men and others, and we know that there were higher degrees of literacy. It's not like you have the Indian Army at the time, which had much lower levels of literacy, are being exposed to this French newspaper as they're covering down. At least we can say that in terms of the ideological exposure. Here's qualitative evidence from historians on the way in which there were ideological treatments that affected what the officers did when they came back. There's plenty of qualitative evidence to suggest that American veterans play a very important and disproportionate role in the revolution, which isn't to say that the entire revolution was caused by American veterans. I should say that carefully. Our argument is that there's a disproportionate role of American veterans, and that the American veterans are very important in the revolution, but not necessarily that the entire revolution is driven by the role just of veterans. We can also look at the extent to which American veterans versus others remain in the Revolutionary Army when they come home at a higher rate than officers from the Royal Army who didn't go. Let's see. This is just a sense of the ledgers that we have from which we drew the original information. They give you the place, they give you the height, they give you distinguishing features. We know the date in which they entered the army. We know the date in which they were killed or left or mutinied or took other actions. So this is our raw material data here from the original ledgers in the French Assembly. Rebellions in the countryside. Forrest MacDonald wrote a very good paper in the 1950s, one of the first to argue that there was a relationship between French Revolution American War of Independence returned veterans and the levels of violence that you saw in the French Revolution. But he did this with cross-hatching and points in the 1950 in a history article. And what we're doing essentially is turning this into more systematic data. Here's the data we collected on riots and Rochambeau veterans in the period before the revolution. And we really find that there's a big change in 1789, as you see down in the bottom. It becomes significantly related in 1789, but not before, if we're trying to relate the number of Rochambeau veterans and the observed level of violence. Just to give you a sense of some of the control variables that we look at, we're looking at the distance to other areas, we're looking at the urban population, population density, we're looking at ideological variables like whether you had secular high schools in your area, Catholic high schools, whether you had revolutionary books being sold at high levels in your particular area. There's actually wholesaler records of subversive booksellers in the period that we can use to try and trace the demand for ideological subversion, if you like, in individual areas, and we try and control for that. Banned books sold, encyclopedia subscriptions, as well as demographic data. It's pre-census, so we have to take what we can get. We've tried to search as hard as we could for different kinds of variables, but it's not perfect. It's not like we're dealing with a 1931 or 1941 Indian census in terms of the variables we're able to capture here. Let's see. I'll just take a couple more minutes. This is political clubs. Again, what we find is that there are higher levels of political clubs in favor of reform in areas with more Rochambeau veterans than we see in areas with Neustrian Anhalt veterans. And in terms of mechanisms, right, is this actually being driven by a concern with democratic values, or do we just see a relationship between number of veterans and observed levels of things like violence? So this is very important for us. These cahiers de doléances, these were the ones that Beatrice Hislop coded in individual ways, and what we find is pretty systematic relationships between the number of Rochambeau returned veterans and more democratic values in an individual bailliage, and we don't see that relationship in the districts, in the bailliage with people from the Neustrie and the Anhalt forces. So let's see. Let's just sum up. There's no evidence that that regiments were selected for military service in America based upon the soldier heights, regiment prestige, any of these other things. American veterans seem to be much more heavily involved in the political turmoil, as judged by membership in political clubs, as judged by involvement in the riots. Also, we have individual data, which I'm not showing here, on how individual members of the French Assembly voted in the period after the revolution. This is disproportionately officers, but we have data on which way they voted in the French Revolution, and we're coding that as well. And I just want to give you just one example at the end, just of the Victorian case. This is a different cell, the Napoleonic War case. This is a different cell of the 2x2 that I showed you earlier, with much larger degrees of deployment. Roughly 10% of British men are being recruited into the army at this period, so much, much higher than in the French case I talked earlier. Roughly 300,000 of these are demobilized in 1816 and another 32,000 in 1817. And if you look at the qualitative data in this period, the ex-soldiers are really active in demands for political rights subsequently. The Luddite insurrections, the East Anglian riots, Pentridge Rising, and the famous Peterloo Massacre. Such that government bans military training in 1819 because they're very worried that these people who are returned and more radical are going to be more involved in pressing for political change in the UK. And there's a lot of veteran involvement in these political movements that we think has a lot to do with the passing the Great Reform Act in 1832 because of larger concerns on the part of the government about significant organized threats and political action taken against them if reform is not granted in that period. And a number of historians and political scientists and economists have come to similar kinds of conclusions to that. So let's stop now, and I'd love to take any questions, and very grateful for any advice and help people can give us. Yeah.
So we'll take another round of questions, but before that, I'll just insert one of my questions in the queue as well. And this is just zooming out a little bit. In your research design, you use the random deployment of troops primarily as a causal identification strategy, but I think it also raises this broader question of how historical contingencies have long-term consequences. And I'm wondering what we can then take from that in terms of thinking about strategy, right? And so we have kind of these outcomes of violence against minorities. We have, on the other hand, this outcome of democratic ideals and investment in certain values. Are there takeaways from this in terms of designing strategy, either at the military level or broadly, that you've thought about? And then I'll put that on the table, and we'll collect other questions as well. So over there.
Could I just?
Yes, yeah, you can.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Numan Amjad from Psychology Department, Punjab University. The comparison that you were drawing, so I'll come back to the Lalpur, and we are descendants of families who migrated from Amritsar to Lalpur. So in one place, was it purposeful deployment for ethnic cleansing? Am I getting it right? As opposed to the other comparison where the army veterans had liberal, revolutionary, sportive ideas. So that's one question. So ethnic cleansing were planned, and if so, who planned on both sides of the border that minorities will be cleaned out or forced to leave? Because Amritsar and Lalpur was one area of migration.
Thanks, Stephen, for a fascinating talk. What I'm struggling with a bit is whether you could have like a general theory from these kind of pieces, because it seems to me one thing that becomes really important is, for example, if I look at sort of Indian veterans in after World War I and World War II, the big question after World War I was demobilization. They came back, they were demobilized, they weren't looked after, and that set off a politics in a very different direction from the politics around partition. And the politics around partition was informed by the state act of partitioning or the political act. Similarly, if I think about experiences there, I'm wondering, I mean, there's the mechanical thing that you get violent skills, but then there's the experiential thing. You're throwing these Indians in a milieu with people from other countries. There are going to be questions of race. There are going to be questions of exposure to ideas. How do we pass these things out and say, well, this is common in these many specific cases? Or perhaps we can't have a general theory and we say, we're going to come up with a framework which are going to give us some direction of paths which are very particular, in which case I think what we need to focus on is what are the initial conditions and how do we use those conditions to define paths. But since you're putting a book together, I thought I'd kind of push this out to start to think of how do we bring these cases together.
Stephen, so you can respond to those, and then we'll do one more round, and we'll go until 10:40.
So, Sarah, I think your question was related a bit to this earlier question of what's the strategy when they come back, or what could be the strategy of the state. Is that right? Some states are much better about thinking about the potential of veterans for destabilization after they come back. There are states like the British Army in the period just before the end of World War II spent a lot of time talking about what you can expect in demobilization, what kind of society are we going back to. There are other armies in history that have done this as well, to essentially try and ease the passage back in. There are also armies that provide economic security, social security to veterans afterwards, which relates to your point about the degree of provision and pensions that people are coming back to, that essentially buys off some level of political discontent and potential to demobilize after they come back. But then it's very difficult for me to think of states that anticipate all the ways in which veterans might mobilize for political rights. People tend to focus on economic and social, but most states don't think about the political aspects. I mean, I'll give you one instance. So after World War II, a lot of African-American veterans come back in the US and press for political change and an end to discrimination there. And we know that they're heavily involved in these movements there. At the time, you have a government administration that's supportive of racial discrimination in the US. It doesn't anticipate this. And I think that's much more common. Most states don't anticipate these kind of political things. They can think about the economic and social aspects, and some try and buy off that, but most states aren't very savvy on the politics of things. And let's see, you talked about who was organizing violence, was that right?
Yes, I mean, if they were deployed, was it pre-partition government and ethnic cleansing that took place? And obviously the historical versions that one side of border is fed is different from the historical version that the other side of the border is fed. So the India-Pakistan versus history books clearly may be in contrast. So if it was purposefully deployed war veterans, Sikh regiment, for example, because we have narratives and reports from families who experienced it that Sikhs were leading. So there's one conspiracy theory that Hindus were protecting their face by letting the martial race get all the blame for the cleansing on that side, where the Muslim trains were pushed to Pakistan. So was it planned? Was it planned by the British or an Indian government that had not yet come into effect?
Yeah. So I guess I would say I see similar things happening on both sides of the border with regard to different communities and strategies, although of course who's in a majority and who's in a minority changes. Another thing to say is that a particular challenge in 1947 is that much of the Indian Army and the Punjab Boundary Force was recruited from the very communities it was being asked to police. And so the army becomes unreliable in August and September and October 1947. And there's plenty of documentation in the archives on this, that people that the units are not as good any longer in controlling things when they're being asked to take action against their co-religionists, which is no big surprise given what's going on in their home districts and some of the things that they're seeing. For instance, the riots in September 1947 in Delhi can only be put down when Gurkhas and Madrasis are brought in, because there are deep concerns, legitimate concerns on the part of the government at the time, that troops drawn from this broader region are unreliable. And that's another issue that we have in 1947. So let's see, in Ali, yeah, excellent question, and I think it relates back to something that Stephen raised earlier, which is about the theory, and does it go both ways, and can you construct a macro theory? And I think our approach is quite consistent, I think, with your one, that these are pathways rather than something that's going to explain every possible case. And I very much appreciate what you're saying, that we need to be tight in terms of figuring out initial conditions and how things are likely to play out in individual contexts. And I also think we need to be quite clear about talking about the political context and socioeconomic context that they come back to, because it's the interaction between these treatments and the exposure that they get, and then the specific environments that they come back to. And do I think we can come up with a theory that explains all war? No. But I also think it's important to realize that war doesn't have one specific effect. And the 2x2 that I showed you is an attempt to grapple with that and say some kinds of wars and environments are likely to have different kinds of effects on average compared to others. And what we're doing is very much in that spirit. But thank you for the suggestions. I think they're exactly right.
All right, so we can take 3 more questions. So let's take Rinchin, and then this one in the front, and then Ilyas. Yeah.
Hi, Steve. Rinchin Mirza from the University of Kent. A fascinating talk. I was just thinking in terms of the treatment that you're looking at currently. My understanding is that this is treatment provided during wartime, and then you have demobilized soldiers, who've come back in their societies, and then they have effects over political and economic outcomes. As an economic historian, I feel persistence is kind of a very important concern here, or somewhat of a concern here, because once those soldiers are demobilized, they're ingrained back into their societies. The channels of persistence that might, remain for decades, it is a bit of a kind of, one needs to think more about that. On a related aspect, there's some work I'm doing on historic military recruitment in India, and maybe there's a different treatment there, because certainly in the Pakistani context, military recruitment tends to be from more or less the same districts. There's a lot of persistence that comes over time. For generations, the same kind of districts tend to recruit into the military. And there are interesting kind of interactions with, the history of military coups that Pakistan has had, and kind of what the reaction to those coups is, and kind of a different kind of a treatment that someone who's a military recruit in society versus someone who's not gets, and how that interacts with political events that happen later on, perhaps. That would, it's a way of kind of thinking more of a different treatment which has persistence built into it, so to speak.
Thank you. Just in the front, if you could pass it. Thanks.
Hello, Haris here. So as you said that the veterans that are not taken care of, they come back and they cause problems, and so in the form of insurgency or other problems. So do you think it has something to do with the training, talking especially in the context of Pakistan and India, bragging authority and, enforcing decisions throughout their life, and when they come back into the normal lives, they don't get to do that. So does that have to do with the training, or should the world move away from the traditional trainings as we see that the wars are changing with the technological advancements? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then in the back, if you can keep your questions short. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Hi, Ijlal Naqvi. So one case which I thought might be of interest to you is that of the slaves who fought during the Revolutionary War as well, but fighting on the loyalist side through British promises that they would later be set free, and then they end up going to Sierra Leone. Maya Jasnal's written about this, and their individuals with military backgrounds are essential to the organizational role that they play. Although their regarding treatment effect, or rather the selection effect, it's complicated because they choose to participate to a degree. And this same challenge, I'm wondering if you wanted to generalize, what if you look at non-elites? Oh, sorry, what if you look at elites? You're looking at non-elites. What if you look at elites? Because from time immemorial, military service and the skills and prestige and honor gained through that is a pathway to leadership. Many people exploit that. If you're looking at US cases, everybody from Dwight Eisenhower to Pete Buttigieg sort of puts themselves up in that category. So what happens if you look at elites as well?
Great, thank you. And last question.
Hi, Steve. I'm Ilyas. I teach partition course, and this your work is basically part of our reading. But just one thing, we have sometimes critique about your really work in class. Most of veterans basically came from canal colonies and also from Marshall area regions. But most of violence happen in urban area. Let's see, in Sialkot was, while I work on Sialkot, most of violence done by Harars. And when we come to Gujranwala, most of violence and on trains done by local Lahores. When we come to Lahore, mainly violence was done by Muslim League, National Guard, RSS, and even Sikh Jatha. So again, if we go for another area, like say in Copeland's work and others, but we're just wondering how can you really differentiate veterans coming from much more rural background, violence happen in urban environment, and also one thing more, can you just say something? That's one thing really. Because like Muslim League National Guard was more than 1 lakh in Lahore only. So they was contributed. Some was Aligarh students and all Milni students. So how you differentiate between veteran and these all non-state actor or maybe students and RSS and other. And second, really, that maybe not related to you, but I'm working on 71, wondering, like veteran or prisoner of war who came back, what their role was in Bhutto, like Tariq-e-Mustafa role and all Islamization, whether they have any role. And also, like one mentioned here, like Afghan veterans, special Russian Afghan veterans who came in Pakistan, what was their role in really political mobilization, manipulation, and even drugs economy?
Okay. Thank you so much. Stephen.
Let's see. Maybe I'll start with Ilyas's question first. First on POWs who come back. I haven't looked at the Pakistani side as much, but on the East Pakistanis who were stationed in the West during the war and then didn't go back until several years after the war, they play a very important role in Bangladeshi politics afterwards. They're very aggrieved when they go back because they see themselves as having been fighters for East Pakistan, the future military leadership of the country, and yet the regime back home, the Mukti Bahini, sees them as turncoats who fought for the other side, and Bangladeshi army is subsequently riven by fights between the returned military soldiers who come back as POWs and have a particular view of themselves and their harsh treatment and view themselves as being discriminated against by the Mukti Bahini regime. And if you look into the history of coups in Bangladesh subsequently and internal fights within the military, that's at the root of a lot of them in the 1970s subsequently. So I've looked at them in that kind of environment, but I haven't looked at this side of the border. I mean, Ilyas, you have, I think, you and maybe one or two other people in the room have just an unparalleled view of the micro level of partition, from deep familiarity with the FIRs and the other documents of the time, and the kind of analysis that I'm doing, which is able to say that there's a relationship between the level of combat exposure in an individual district and outcomes that is robust to things like the urban percentage in a different district or district fixed effects, is a different kind of analysis that finds that on average you get these kind of effects, but but it doesn't completely allow for the kind of individual micro differences that you're finding. All I could say is, on average, what we find is what we find, but I don't have access to your kind of qualitatively rich data. But you're looking at individual cases. I'm looking at a much larger number of cases, but you're looking in more depth, and we're finding somewhat different things. Let's see. The Sierra Leone example, I think, was super interesting. Thank you very much for that as a case. It raises, and you talked about elites as well. So clearly, elites have differential capacity to act. You can think of individual cases like the Russian soldiers who go and occupy Paris after the Napoleonic Wars, who then go back and are involved in the Decembrist movement in 1825 that tries to liberalize the Tsarist monarchy at that time. And you can draw a very direct line from elites, ideological exposure, different treatment in combat. They then come back and are disproportionately involved in this. And we do try and look at elites as well as masses in the overall project. Actually, when you were talking about this, I was reminded of something that Ali Chima asked about as well that I didn't talk about, which is the kind of wartime experience and the ideological treatments they get. We have tried to look at this in the larger project. So one thing we tried to look at in the partition paper was, are you a member of an army that wins versus loses, or serves in Japan, serves in Europe, in terms of your combat exposure? And I have to admit, we sort of expected to find differences between the Japan, the people who fought in Burma and on the Eastern Front from the Indian Army versus those on the West, but we didn't, when we partitioned the data, actually find significant differences there. But we can think of other cases where the kind of environment you're fighting in does seem to make a big difference. So for instance, the French soldiers who fought in Vietnam in the early 1950s in an unsuccessful attempt by France to hold on to its colonial empire, then go back to the Algerian French, then go back and are very active in the Algerian War of Independence and bring military tactics and organization back home. And qualitatively, you look at those cases or cases of the Black African soldiers and Arab soldiers who fight for defeated France in World War II and the kind of treatment they get. Those people are very involved in the decolonization efforts in the 1950s and 60s. So yes, that makes a difference too. We can definitely point to individual cases like that. Let's see, there was a question about technology that you asked that I think is very important, right? The military experience that somebody gets from sitting in a drone chair somewhere in the middle of the US or some other country, as opposed to being out and serving with common soldier, with your peer soldiers in frontline experience, where you're living as a community that's very tight for months and months and months, if not years, clearly has to be very different. And one of the issues we've tried to think about theoretically is the big differences between the character of war over time and how technology is likely to alter the way in which some of the effects we were talking about is likely to play out in the future. So thank you for raising that as a point. See, that's it, I think, in the response to your question. Thank you very much.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Stephen, and thank you all for being an engaged audience.